The sun was setting over Pine Grove when Officer Reynolds started his evening patrol, his police cruiser rolling slowly through the tree-lined streets of the affluent Highland district. The orange glow of dusk painted the mansion-style homes in warm hues, but Reynolds' mind was far from appreciating the scenery. His jaw clenched as he passed a group of teenagers walking home from basketball practice, his eyes lingering a bit too long on the only two brown-skinned boys in the group. It had been a rough week for Reynolds. Just that morning, his supervisor had pulled him aside for what felt like the 100th time. "Your stop numbers are raising eyebrows again," the sergeant had said, sliding a folder across the desk. "The racial breakdown doesn't match our district demographics. Not even close." Reynolds had barely listened, nodding mechanically while internally dismissing the concern. In his mind, he was just doing his job, keeping the right kind of people in this neighborhood. The truth was, Reynolds had a thick file in internal affairs that would make any decent cop's stomach turn. Complaint after complaint detailed similar stories. Minority drivers pulled over for phantom violations, unnecessarily aggressive questioning, and thinly veiled hostile remarks. Yet somehow he'd managed to stay on the force, skating by with written warnings and mandatory sensitivity trainings that he sat through with barely concealed contempt. As his cruiser turned onto Maple Avenue, Reynolds caught his reflection in the rearview mirror. 15 years on the force had left their mark. Deep creases around his eyes, a permanent furrow between his brows. He'd started as a fresh-faced rookie with dreams of making a difference, but somewhere along the way, those dreams had curdled into something darker. The neighborhoods he patrolled had changed over the years, becoming more diverse, and with each change, his resentment had grown. His radio crackled with routine updates. A noise complaint across town, a fender bender near the shopping center. Reynolds barely registered them, his attention caught by the gleam of an expensive SUV rolling through a stop sign. At least, that's what he would write in his report later. In reality, the vehicle had come to a complete stop, its signal blinking properly as it turned onto the main road. What really caught Reynolds' eye was the glimpse he got of the driver and passenger through the tinted windows, two well-dressed black men in business suits. His mind immediately started spinning a familiar tale, probably drug money, maybe stolen vehicle. The same old story he told himself countless times before. Never mind that this neighborhood had plenty of successful black residents. Reynolds flipped on his lights, a familiar surge of anticipation coursing through him. He'd done this so many times before. Find a minor violation, real or imagined, use it as an excuse to run IDs, search the vehicle if possible. His supervisor's warning from that morning flickered briefly through his mind, but he pushed it aside. This was different, he told himself. This time, he had a real reason for the stop. As he radioed in the plate number and his location, Reynolds didn't know that this stop would be different from all the others. He couldn't see the police captain's badges tucked away in the briefcases on the back seat. He had no idea that his next actions would set in motion a chain of events that would not only end his career but spark a transformation in the department he thought he knew so well. The SUV pulled over smoothly, its hazard lights blinking in the growing darkness. Reynolds adjusted his body camera, not knowing that every word, every action he was about to take would be scrutinized by his superiors, the media, and eventually the entire nation. He stepped out of his cruiser, flashlight in hand, completely unaware that his comfortable world of unchecked prejudice was about to come crashing down around him. The stage was set for a confrontation that would change everything. Not just for Officer Reynolds, but for an entire police department that had allowed bias to fester in its ranks for far too long. Inside the black SUV, two of the city's highest-ranking police captains were wrapping up a conversation of the leadership conference they'd just attended. The passenger was adjusting his tie, still energized from the panel discussion where he'd spoken about community policing. The driver, his colleague of 15 years, was telling him about the notes he'd taken during the workshop on departmental reform. "That speaker really hit the nail on the head," the driver said, carefully observing the speed limit. When he talked about changing police culture from within, that's exactly what we've been trying to do at our precinct. His badge and ID were safely tucked away in his briefcase on the back seat, along with a folder full of ideas he couldn't wait to implement. They were both dressed in their finest suits, having represented their respective precincts at the regional conference. Between them, they shared 40 years of law enforcement experience and countless commendations. The passenger had just been featured in the local newspaper for starting a youth mentorship program, while the driver had recently led a successful initiative to reduce gang violence through community engagement. Red and blue lights suddenly flashed in their rearview mirror, cutting through their professional discussion. The driver checked his speedometer. He was going exactly the limit. He'd been extra careful, a habit born from years of experiencing traffic stops from the other side of the badge. Both men shared a knowing look. They'd been here before, but this time they were the ones being pulled over. "Here we go again," the passenger sighed, straightening his suit jacket. Despite their ranks and achievements, both men knew the drill. They'd given countless presentations to fellow officers about maintaining composure during traffic stops, especially as black men in law enforcement. Now they were about to live through another example of why such talks were necessary. The driver carefully pulled over, positioning the SUV perfectly on the shoulder. He turned on the interior lights and placed both hands on the steering wheel. Textbook procedure. His colleague did the same, hands visible on his knees. Years of experience had taught them these precautions weren't just guidelines, they were survival skills. Through the side mirror, they watched the officer approach, his flashlight beam dancing aggressively across their vehicle. They could tell from his walk, his posture, that this wasn't going to be a pleasant encounter. The conference materials in their briefcases included statistics about racial profiling, statistics they were about to become part of despite their badges. "Our badges are in the back," the driver whispered to his colleague. "Should we mention them right away?" It was a tricky situation they discussed before but never experienced together. Revealing their status too early could escalate things if the officer felt challenged, but staying quiet meant enduring unnecessary harassment. The passenger shook his head slightly. "Let's see how he handles it first. Document everything." Both men were thinking about the countless training sessions they'd conducted on proper traffic stop procedures. They were about to get a first-hand demonstration of exactly what not to do. As the officer's footsteps got closer, they could hear him muttering something under his breath. The flashlight beam was almost blinding now, deliberately aimed at their faces through the driver's window. Both captains remained perfectly still, their years of experience telling them this stop was about to become an incident that would rock their department to its core. They weren't just two police captains about to be harassed by a prejudiced officer. They were about to become catalysts for change. Every word, every action in the next few minutes would matter. As the officer tapped on the window with his flashlight, both men silently prepared themselves for what was coming, knowing their response would need to be perfect. The stage was set for a confrontation that would expose the deep-rooted issues they'd just spent days discussing at the conference. Sometimes change needs a spark, and that spark was about to ignite. License and registration. Officer Reynolds barked, his flashlight beam still aimed directly at the driver's eyes. His tone was sharp enough to cut through steel. Nothing like the professional courtesy he usually showed to drivers in this upscale neighborhood. The two police captains exchanged a quick glance, years of training keeping their faces neutral despite the hostile greeting. "Good evening, officer," the driver replied calmly, his hands still visible on the steering wheel. "May I ask why you've pulled us over?" His voice carried the steady authority of someone who'd made thousands of traffic stops himself, though he carefully kept any hint of that authority hidden. Reynolds' response came quick and harsh. "You roll through that stop sign back there. Playing dumb won't help you." I saw it clear as day. It was a lie, and all three men knew it. The driver had come to a complete stop, just as he'd done at every traffic signal for the past 20 years of his law enforcement career. "Sir, I'm certain I made a complete stop," the driver said evenly, maintaining his composure. "I always do." The passenger remained silent, mentally recording every detail of the encounter. The way Reynolds' hand rested on his holster, the aggressive stance, the deliberate intimidation tactics, all textbook examples of what they taught officers not to do. "Step out of the vehicle, both of you," Reynolds demanded, taking a step back and placing his hand more firmly on his weapon. "Keep your hands where I can see them." The captains shared another look. This was escalating exactly as they'd feared. "Officer," the passenger spoke up for the first time, his voice steady and calm, "I want to inform you that we have identification in our briefcases in the back seat. We're happy to comply with your instructions, but we want to make sure everyone stays safe here." Reynolds scoffed, his flashlight beam swinging between their faces. "Oh, I'm sure you've got all sorts of things in those briefcases." "Out of the car." Now, the contempt in his voice was unmistakable, a tone they'd heard described countless times in civilian complaints. Following procedure to the letter, both captains slowly opened their doors. Their movements were deliberate and smooth, hands clearly visible at all times. They'd taught these same safety protocols to countless rookie officers, never expecting to be on this side of such a blatantly biased stop. The chilly night air hit them as they stood beside the SUV, hands raised slightly at shoulder level. Reynolds ordered them to face the vehicle and place their hands on the roof. The cold metal beneath their palms was a stark reminder of how quickly things could go wrong, even for two decorated police captains. "Spread your legs," Reynolds commanded, beginning a pat-down that was far more aggressive than necessary. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" The question came with an unmistakable undertone, one that had no place in professional police work. "We're coming from a law enforcement conference," the driver started to explain, but Reynolds cut him off with a harsh laugh. "Yeah, right. And I'm the police commissioner." He pulled out his handcuffs. "You two just sit tight while I run your plates. Any sudden moves, and we'll have a problem." The sound of approaching sirens cut through the tension. Backup units responding to Reynolds' location call. The captains remained perfectly still, knowing the next few minutes would be crucial. They could hear Reynolds calling in their plate number, his voice carrying that smug certainty of someone who thought he had caught some criminals. As the first backup unit pulled up, its lights painting the scene in red and blue, both captains stood motionless, still facing their vehicle. They'd spent years working to change the system from within, and now they were about to become living proof of why that change was so desperately needed. Neither man spoke as more patrol cars arrived. They didn't need to. Soon enough, their badges would do the talking for them, and Officer Reynolds would learn the hardest lesson of his career. The scene on the quiet suburban street had turned into something out of a police procedural show. 3 patrol cars were now parked behind the SUV, their flashing lights creating a disco of red and blue against the darkened houses. Neighbors had begun peeking through their curtains, curious about the commotion on their usually peaceful street. Reynolds had just finished handcuffing both captains, his movements rough and unnecessarily aggressive. The cold metal bit into their wrists as they stood there, still facing their vehicle. The whole situation would have been almost laughable if it weren't so serious. 2 of the city's highest-ranking officers being treated like common criminals. "Officer," the driver tried one more time, his voice leveled despite the circumstances. "If you'll just check our briefcases, you'll find our credentials." But Reynolds wasn't listening. He was too busy putting on a show for the newly arrived backup officers, strutting around like a peacock who'd just caught something big. "Got 2 suspicious individuals here," Reynolds announced to his colleagues, puffing up his chest. "Caught them creeping through the neighborhood in an expensive vehicle, probably stolen." The other officers looked uncomfortable, shifting their weight from foot to foot. Something about the 2 detained men's calm demeanor didn't fit the picture Reynolds was painting. One of the backup officers approached the SUV with a flashlight, scanning the interior. His beam caught the edge of a familiar-looking briefcase in the back seat. Standard issue department leather, the kind given to high-ranking officers. His gut told him something wasn't adding up. The night air had grown colder, but both captains remained perfectly still, their faces masks of patience. They'd dealt with officers like Reynolds before, not as victims, but as supervisors reviewing complaint files. Every second of this stop was mental ammunition for the changes they'd been pushing for in the department. A new set of headlights cut through the darkness as another vehicle approached. This one was different. An unmarked police car with subdued emergency lights. The shift supervisor had arrived, drawn by the unusual number of units at a simple traffic stop. The supervisor, a veteran surgeon with 25 years on the force, stepped out of his car. He walked toward the scene, his experienced eyes taking in every detail. The expensive SUV, the professional attire of the detained men, the way they held themselves. Something wasn't right. "What's the situation here, Reynolds?" the surgeon asked, his flashlight beam sweeping across the scene. As the light passed over the face of the passenger captain, the surgeon's steps faltered. His expression changed from professional curiosity to shocked recognition. "Oh my God," the surgeon breathed, moving closer. "Captain." The word hung in the air like a thunderclap. Reynolds, who had been in the middle of explaining his big catch, stopped mid-sentence. The passenger captain turned slightly, meeting the surgeon's gaze. "Good evening, Sergeant. Bit of a situation here." His voice was calm, but there was steel beneath the words. The surgeon's face had gone pale, his eyes darting between the handcuffed captains and Officer Reynolds. "Get those cuffs off them. Now," the surgeon barked, his voice cracking with authority. Reynolds stood frozen, the color draining from his face as realization began to dawn. The backup officers rushed forward, fumbling with their handcuff keys, suddenly eager to end this embarrassing scenario. As the cuffs came off, both captains calmly rubbed their wrists. The driver spoke first, his voice carrying across the now silent scene. "Sergeant, we'll need our briefcases from the back seat. Our badges and IDs are inside." His tone was professional, but everyone present could hear the storm brewing beneath his calm exterior. Reynolds stood rooted to the spot, watching as his whole world began to crumble around him. He'd just handcuffed 2 police captains, and his body camera had recorded every second of it. The mood on the street shifted dramatically as the sergeant retrieved the briefcases from the SUV. His hands were shaking slightly as he handed them to their owners. The backup officers had formed a loose circle around the scene, their faces a mixture of shock and disbelief as the 2 captains pulled out their badges and department IDs. The gold badges caught the light from the patrol cars, seeming to glow with authority. The driver was more than just a captain. He was the head of internal affairs for the neighboring precinct. His colleague, the passenger, commanded the department's community relations division. They were, quite literally, the last 2 people any officer would want to wrongfully detain. "Officer Reynolds," the sergeant said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger, "would you care to explain why you handcuffed 2 decorated police captains during a routine traffic stop?" Reynolds opened his mouth, but no words came out. His earlier swagger had evaporated, replaced by a sickly pallor. The driver captain straightened his suit jacket, now wrinkled from the ordeal. "Actually, Sergeant," he said calmly, "I'd prefer Officer Reynolds' Seika's explanation for the formal hearing. I'm sure Internal Affairs will be very interested in reviewing his body camera footage." The words landed like heavy stones in a quiet pond. Nearby residents had gathered on their porches, watching the scene unfold. They'd witnessed the entire incident, from the aggressive stop to the shocking revelation. Several had their phones out, recording everything. By morning, this would be more than just an internal department matter. The passenger captain was examining his wrists, where the 2 tight handcuffs had left angry red marks. "Sergeant," he said, his voice carrying the weight of his position, "I believe we'll need incident reports from every officer present." He gestured to the growing crowd of onlookers. "And you might want to get contact information from these witnesses." Reynolds stood rooted to the spot, his face a mask of dawning horror. Every racist comment, every aggressive action, every violation of procedure had been captured by his body camera. His career was flashing before his eyes, and he knew it was over. The sound of another vehicle approaching drew everyone's attention. This one was a large black SUV with official department plates. The chief of police had arrived. Word traveled fast in law enforcement, especially when it involved two high-ranking officers being handcuffed on the side of the road. As the chief stepped out of his vehicle, the air seemed to get even heavier. He was a tall man with graying hair and the kind of presence that commanded immediate respect. His face was a thundercloud as he surveyed the scene before him. "Gentlemen," the chief addressed the captains, his voice tight with controlled anger, "I just got an interesting call about this incident." He turned to face Reynolds, who seemed to shrink under his gaze. "Officer Reynolds, I believe you're done for the night. Report to my office first thing tomorrow morning." The backup officers began clearing the scene, their radios crackling with coded messages. The spectators continued recording, knowing they were witnessing something significant. This wasn't just about one bad traffic stop. This was going to change things. The two captains stood together, their badges now properly displayed on their jackets. They'd spent years trying to change the system from within, pushing against the walls of institutional bias. Now, thanks to Officer Reynolds' mistake, they had the perfect opportunity to make real change happen. The driver captain looked at his colleague, a silent understanding passing between them. This incident wouldn't be swept under the rug or handled quietly. This would be their chance to address the systemic issues they've been fighting for years. Sometimes, the best lessons come from the worst mistakes. The next morning, the police station buzzed with nervous energy. Word of last night's incident had spread like wildfire through the department. Officers gathered in small groups, speaking in hushed tones as they discussed what had happened. The story seemed almost unbelievable. Officer Reynolds pulling over and handcuffing two police captains. In the chief's office, the atmosphere was thick enough to cut with a knife. Reynolds sat in a chair, looking smaller than ever in his pressed uniform. His hands were clasped tightly in his lap, knuckles white with tension. Across from him, the chief sat behind his desk, a folder open in front of him. "Do you know what I have here?" the chief asked, his voice unnaturally calm. "This is your complete file. Every complaint, every write-up, every warning." He began laying out papers one by one. 15 complaints of racial profiling in the past year alone. 23 instances of excessive force during routine stops. Multiple warnings about your conduct. Reynolds stared at the floor, unable to meet his superior's gaze. The body camera footage from last night played on a screen behind the chief's desk, silently showing his actions in damning detail. His contemptuous tone, his aggressive behavior, every mistake captured in high definition. "But last night," the chief continued, leaning forward, "last night you really outdid yourself. Not only did you profile and harass two fellow officers, but you managed to handcuff two of our most respected captains. One of them runs internal affairs for the neighboring precinct. The other has been featured in the national news for his work in community relations." Through the office window, Reynolds could see news vans pulling up outside the station. Someone had leaked the story to the media. Cell phone videos from witnesses were already circulating online, showing him aggressively handcuffing the two well-dressed captains. "Sir," Reynolds started, his voice barely a whisper, "I can explain." The chief held up his hand, cutting him off. "Explain what?" "How you ignored their attempts to identify themselves. How you made racially charged comments that were caught on your own body camera. How you violated at least 15 department procedures during one traffic stop." Down the hall, in the department's largest conference room, both captains were meeting with internal affairs investigators. Their wrists still showed marks from the handcuffs, photographed now as evidence. Their testimony was measured and professional, focusing on facts rather than emotions. "This isn't just about one bad traffic stop," the driver captain explained to the investigators. "This is about a pattern of behavior that's been ignored for too long. Officer Reynolds isn't an anomaly. He's a symptom of a larger problem. Back in the chief's office, Reynolds watched as his badge and gun were placed in an evidence bag. His hands trembled as he signed the paperwork for his immediate suspension. But this was just the beginning. The department would be facing a full review of its practices. Outside, reporters were gathering in greater numbers. The story had struck a nerve, becoming a symbol of the ongoing issues between law enforcement and minority communities. But this time, the victims were fellow officers who knew exactly how to document and address the misconduct. The passenger captain stood at his office window, watching the media circus below. His phone hadn't stopped ringing since morning. Calls from other departments, civil rights organizations, and police reform advocates. This incident would force the changes they'd been pushing for years. Sometimes, he said to his colleague, it takes a perfect storm to bring about real change. They looked at the growing crowd of reporters together, knowing that their unfortunate experience would become a catalyst for department-wide reform. The story was far from over. As Reynolds left the station through a side door, his career in law enforcement finished. The wheels of change were already turning. Sometimes karma comes in unexpected ways, and sometimes mistakes lead to meaningful improvements. The internal affairs investigation moved at lightning speed. Within days, the department's conference room had transformed into a command center for what was becoming the most thorough police conduct review in the city's history. Boxes of files lined the walls, not just Reynolds records, but similar complaints from across the department. The two captains sat through hours of interviews, recounting every detail of that night. Their words carried extra weight because they knew exactly what should have happened during a proper traffic stop. Every procedure Reynolds had violated was noted with professional precision. "Play that section again," one investigator said, leaning forward as they reviewed the body camera footage for the dozenth time. The video showed Reynolds' aggressive approach, his dismissive tone, the way he'd ignored their attempts to identify themselves. But it was his muttered comments that drew the most attention. Racial slurs caught clearly on the audio. The station's normally quiet hallways buzzed with activity. Officers who had worked with Reynolds over the years were called in one by one to give statements. Many spoke of incidents they'd witnessed, but never reported, their guilt now evident as they described his pattern of misconduct. "I should have said something sooner," one young officer admitted during his interview. But he was a senior officer. "I didn't think anyone would listen." His testimony joined dozens of others, painting a picture of a department that had allowed bad behavior to go unchecked for far too long. The driver captain, wearing the same suit from the night of the incident, spread documents across the conference table. "Look at these numbers," he said, pointing to a chart. "Traffic stops, use of force, arrest rates. The racial disparities are impossible to ignore." His colleague nodded, adding another stack of papers to the growing evidence. Outside the station, the media presence hadn't diminished. News crews camped out daily, hoping to catch anyone involved in the investigation. The story had struck a chord with the public, especially after cell phone videos from witnesses went viral. This wasn't just another police misconduct case. This was two respected police captains being profiled by one of their own. The passenger captain found himself in demand for interviews, carefully choosing his words to focus on solutions rather than anger. "This isn't about one officer," he explained to reporters. "This is about changing a culture that allowed this behavior to continue unchecked." In a small office down the hall, tech specialists combed through Reynolds' patrol car computer records. Years of traffic stops were analyzed, revealing a clear pattern of targeting minority drivers. The data told a story that couldn't be explained away or justified. The chief of police aged visibly as the investigation continued. Each new revelation hit like a physical blow, showing just how much had been missed under his watch. "We're going to fix this," he promised during a department meeting. "Whatever it takes." Community leaders began showing up at the station, not to protest, but to offer support and suggestions for reform. The two captains welcomed them. knowing that real change would require input from all sides. Meeting rooms filled with people eager to be part of the solution. The investigation's scope widened beyond Reynolds. Other officers with similar complaint patterns were identified, their records pulled for review. The passenger captain spent hours drafting new training protocols, determined to prevent similar incidents in the future. Sometimes it takes a shock to wake people up, the driver captain remarked during a brief break. He rubbed his wrist, the marks from the handcuffs now faded, but the memory still fresh. But what matters is what we do with that wake-up call. 2 weeks after the incident, the police department's largest meeting room was packed for the disciplinary hearing. Officers lined the walls, while community leaders and media representatives filled every available seat. The tension in the room was thick as Reynolds faced the consequences of his actions. Reynolds sat alone at a small table, his uniform replaced by a plain dark suit that seemed to hang loosely on his frame. The past 2 weeks had taken their toll. His face was drawn, and gray had begun spreading through his hair. Before him sat the disciplinary board, their faces stern as they reviewed the evidence one final time. Officer Reynolds, the board chairman, began, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed room. We've reviewed the body camera footage, your service record, and testimony from multiple witnesses. The evidence shows a clear pattern of racial profiling and misconduct culminating in the unlawful detention of 2 superior officers. The 2 captains sat in the front row, their presence a powerful reminder of that night. They'd chosen not to press personal charges, believing that systemic change was more important than individual punishment. Their focus was on using this incident to push through the reforms they've been advocating for years. Beyond the incident itself, the chairman continued, our investigation has revealed numerous complaints that were inadequately addressed. Your actions have not only violated department policy, but have broken the public's trust in law enforcement. Reynolds stared at the table in front of him, unable to meet anyone's eyes. His lawyer had advised him to express remorse, but words seemed inadequate in the face of his documented behavior. The body camera footage playing silently on screens around the room told the real story. The board's decision was unanimous. Reynolds' termination was immediate and permanent, his pension forfeited, and his law enforcement certification would be revoked. But the hearing didn't end there. The board had more to say about department-wide changes, new training requirements, and stronger oversight measures. This incident has forced us to confront uncomfortable truths, the passenger captain addressed the room after the hearing. But it's also given us an opportunity to make real changes. He outlined new programs, mandatory bias training, community oversight committees, and revised traffic stop procedures. The driver captain stepped forward with additional announcements. Every officer would now undergo regular sensitivity training. Body camera footage would be reviewed randomly by civilian committees. Traffic stop data would be analyzed monthly for signs of racial disparity. The department was transforming from the inside out. Outside the station, community members gathered not in protest, but in support of the changes. Signs reading "Change starts here" and "Moving forward together" replaced the angry messages of previous weeks. The incident had become a catalyst for positive transformation. Local news crews interviewed officers leaving the hearing. Young cops spoke about feeling empowered to report misconduct. Veteran officers admitted the need for change. The wall of silence that had protected bad behavior was crumbling, replaced by a commitment to transparency and accountability. The 2 captains stood together watching the scene unfold. Their ordeal had sparked something bigger than themselves, a genuine movement for reform within the department. Other precincts were already reaching out, asking to implement similar changes. It's just the beginning, the driver captain said quietly. But it's a real beginning. His colleague nodded, thinking of all the work ahead. They had turned a humiliating experience into an opportunity for meaningful change, proving that sometimes the worst moments can lead to the best outcomes. As the sun set on the station, the message was clear. This wasn't just about punishing one officer. It was about creating a new culture of accountability and respect within law enforcement. The road ahead would be challenging, but for the first time in years, real change felt possible. 6 months after that fateful traffic stop, the police department had transformed in ways no one could have predicted. The two captains stood at the podium in the city's main conference center, addressing a room full of law enforcement officers from across the country. Their story had become a blueprint for police reform. Change isn't just about new rules, the driver captain explained to the packed audience. It's about creating a new culture. Behind him, slides showed the impressive results of their reforms. Civilian complaints had dropped by 60%. Traffic stop data showed no racial disparities for the first time in department history. The passenger captain stepped forward, holding up his department's new training manual. 6 months ago, we were handcuffed on the side of the road because of one officer's prejudice. Today, we're showing you how to make sure that never happens again. The room erupted in applause. In the front row, their chief of police watched with pride. The department's transformation had made national news, but the real changes were visible in the daily interactions between officers and citizens. Body cameras weren't just recording devices anymore, they were tools for training and improvement. Our officers now review their own footage regularly, the driver captain continued. They learn from their interactions, both good and bad. We celebrate the positive examples and address the concerns before they become problems. The audience scribbled notes, eager to implement similar programs in their own departments. Outside the conference center, community members staffed information booths about the new Civilian Oversight Committee. What had started as a response to crisis had evolved into a model of community policing. Citizens and officers worked together, building trust through transparency and accountability. The local news played clips from recent community meetings where officers and residents sat together, discussing neighborhood concerns as equals. The tensions of the past had been replaced by genuine cooperation. Even former critics of the department now served on advisory boards. Remember that night? The passenger captain asked his colleague during a break. They both smiled, thinking of how far they'd come. The handcuff marks had long since faded, but the determination to create lasting change had only grown stronger. The reforms hadn't always been easy. Some officers had resisted the changes at first, clinging to old habits and attitudes. But as the positive results became clear, even the skeptics had come around. The department's success had become a source of pride for everyone involved. Young officers now went through enhanced training that included real-world scenarios and cultural sensitivity workshops. Veterans served as mentors, sharing their experiences and learning new approaches. The wall between police and community had been replaced by bridges of understanding. Former Officer Reynolds' case had become a teaching tool, studied in police academies as an example of how bias could blind even experienced officers. But the focus wasn't on blame. It was on prevention, on building a police force that truly served and protected everyone equally. The two captains wrapped up their presentation to a standing ovation. Police chiefs from other cities lined up to speak with them, eager to learn more about implementing similar changes. Their personal ordeal had sparked a movement that was spreading across the country. As they packed up their materials, a young officer approached them. "My department is just starting these reforms," she said. "It's not easy, but seeing your success gives us hope." The captains smiled, remembering their own difficult beginning. Sometimes, the driver captain replied, "The worst moments lead to the best changes. What matters is what you do with the opportunity." They looked out over the crowd of officers, community leaders, and citizens all working together for positive change. Their story had come full circle, from victims of prejudice to architects of reform.